we know that civil society is really a foundation for democracy anywhere, and giving it an enabling environment to be strong and free is just critical. And so we know that in Angola there's been a long struggle. There have been efforts to try to control civil society, but fortunately there have been counter efforts to ensure that it remains free. And likewise, in other parts of Africa, civil society has struggled to maintain its independence. We know that just recently in Zimbabwe, there was a victory for civil society that I'm sure we will hear about in terms of resisting the NGO legislation that would have made it much more difficult for civil society to do its important work. But there are certainly other examples from the region of how civil society has succeeded in maintaining its independence. And I'm sure that our Angolan friends will have much to learn and much to contribute to this dialogue. So, I congratulate Elisa for organizing this event and for the other partners that were involved in putting it together. I'm so happy that we were able to do this. I look forward to a very stimulating discussion this afternoon. It's the place to be. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Dave, pelas considerações. Agora vamos passar a palavra para o Dr. Guilherme. Dr. Guilherme é certamente bastante conhecido por nós, além de advogado, mas também o diretor executivo das Bons Livros. E eu penso que vou passar a palavra ao Dr. Guilherme para poder fazer as suas considerações de abertura deste programa. Dr. Guilherme, claro, Dr. Guilherme.
Boa tarde, companheiros, companheiras, manos e manos. Desejar boas-vindas nessa nossa atividade. Essa atividade está a ser realizada no quadro do Grupo de Monitoria dos Direitos Humanos e desde o momento que tomamos conhecimento da aprovação da lei sobre o novo estatuto das ONGs, o Grupo de Monitoria reuniu e decidiu então desenvolver uma ação de advocacia no sentido de pressionar o governo a recuar da sua decisão, porque a norma restringe de que maneira o espaço cívico. É uma norma discriminatória que tenta colocar as ONGs como de criminosas fossem, que não é realidade. É uma norma que entra em contradição com vários normativos da Constituição e também nós consideramos ser um recuo na nossa democracia. Lembrar que o Estado angolano está democrático desde 1991 e ela fundamenta a promoção da democracia, liberdades e direitos fundamentais. O que irá acontecer se esta norma passar na especialidade poderá ferir os direitos fundamentais, liberdades fundamentais das associações. Isso implicaria excluir, de um lado, as ONGs promotoras de direitos humanos e da democracia no nosso país, ferindo assim princípios bem claros, a olhar pelo artigo 48, ao se termos em conta o artigo 52, que tem a ver com a participação de todos na vida pública e política. Também isso fere um dos articulados que diz que os direitos e liberdades fundamentais são restringidos em 3 momentos, ou quando estamos em estado de calamidade, ou quando há uma emergência, ou então quando estamos em estado de sítio. E a nossa norma diz que o Estado, nos termos do artigo 21, que são as tarefas fundamentais, diz que é tarefa do Estado alargar cada vez mais o exercício dos direitos e liberdades fundamentais. E o que está a acontecer aqui é a tendência de o Executivo forçar o Estado a despir-se das suas funções, que é garantir os direitos fundamentais dos cidadãos e cada vez alargar esse espaço do ponto de vista do seu exercício. Ou seja, em conclusão, podemos dizer que há tendência do poder executivo tentar excluir um determinado grupo de participar na vida pública e política. Por quê? Porque ele está mais preocupado com as ONGs, não se sabe o que acontece com ele, mas dizer essa tendência não é de hoje. Muitas das nossas organizações aqui presentes já foram perseguidas. A nós, por exemplo, as mãos livres, já tivemos perseguições diretas. A SOS Habitat viu as suas contas canceladas. Tivemos o problema da Umunga. Recentemente, a Umunga foi impedida de realizar atividades em Cabinda. Em Benguela aconteceu. O Jambo Cultural também teve esse incidente no BIE. Então, independentemente da própria norma, já existem ações concretas que visam restringir o exercício das nossas liberdades. Daí que nos juntamos, não só nós enquanto promotoria, mas como outros movimentos. Importante dizer aqui, desde que começamos com esta atividade, muitas organizações realizaram ações, podemos aqui destacar a Mudei, e mobilizou o país todo e realizou ações tão visíveis. O grupo de monitoria, que entrou com uma petição, mas também realizou outros programas e debates. E aqui, mais uma vez, vamos dar continuidade, vamos aproveitar, colher experiências dos outros países que também passaram, alguns ainda estão passando a mesma situação, e, no entanto, para fortalecer aquilo que é a nossa estratégia de advocacia. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado.
Obrigado, doutor Brian. Muito obrigado. Eu penso, a mim ser desculpas, nós estamos relativamente atrasados e já agora gostaríamos convidar a advogada Fiona Leaf, que é consultora jurídica senior do Programa de Defensores de Justiça Africana Subsaariana e do Centro para os Direitos Humanos da Organização. Também gostaríamos de convidar a doutora Nanga, a advogada e o ponto focal da Associação dos Advogados Americanos cá em Angola. Eu peço desculpas que não de repente foi o que foi a nota que eu recebi. Por favor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Fiona Island. I'm with the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights, Justice Studies Program in Sub-Saharan Africa. Can everybody in the room listen online? We are sharing. Testing? Is that better? Sure. I'm Sharon Einert with the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights Justice Defenders Program in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'd like to thank you very much for welcoming me here. My colleague Nanga and I wrote an analysis of the NGO bill that was introduced in Parliament in May and is waiting to go to the Speciality Committee for clause-by-clause debate. So we just wanted to give a quick summary of our analysis. It's available online, both in English and in Portuguese. So please do share and use it for your advocacy as much as possible. I know that ICNL have also done an analysis that's currently in English, so I hope they're very helpful for you. If we can go to the next slide. So the justification report for this bill is very enlightening in terms of the true intent of the bill. The word controlling NGOs comes up a lot. But generally speaking, the justification report says that the bill is necessary because the 2015 NGO regulation was revoked by the Constitutional Court in 2017. And that was due to procedural reasons, not substantive. So the bill, the act, a regulation, was passed by a presidential decree, which was not the correct procedure in terms of the Constitution. So the 2002 NGO regulation decree is now the current regulation in force, but in their report, it's highlighted that this decree is now out of date. So a new one is needed. And the report states that the private associations law is not specific to NGOs, and we need a specific legislation relating to NGOs. Generally, the report also says that there's need to control the sources, means, and destination of financial resources of NGOs to make sure that those finances are used in the public interest, and to guard against institutions with dubious purposes detrimental to the security of the state providing funding to Angolan NGOs, and to adapt and coordinate NGO interventions to the economic and social context, to partner NGOs with the executive, and to address terrorist financing and money laundering risks in the non-profit sector. The main focus seems to be to make sure that the state has more control of NGOs and their finances and activities. The focus is also on terrorist financing and money laundering. If we could just go to the next slide, please. So the state has used the Financial Action Task Force recommendations on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing to justify this legislation. And this is something that we're seeing across the region. And my colleague Rose is here to talk to us about the bill that was being attempted to pass in Zimbabwe. For similar reasons. And generally, we're seeing a misapplication of the FATF or GAFI recommendations in a restrictive manner to restrict civic space. The FATF recommendations, which my colleague from ICNL will expand on in more detail in the next presentation, are recommendations by a non-treaty intergovernmental body. They're not legally binding, but they're generally persuasive international standards on anti-money laundering and counter-funding of terrorism. There's a recommendation, that's recommendation 8, that's specific to non-profit organizations. And broadly speaking, it says that states are required to review laws and frameworks for at-risk organizations that are at risk of being abused for money laundering or terrorist financing, to identify specific non-profit organizations at risk of being abused for terrorist financing or money laundering abuse, and to do so, to identify them in ongoing consultation with the sector. Then there's supposed to be a targeted approach for those organizations to address, to implement proportionate focused mitigation measures to those organizations. But the measures are not supposed to be applied to the whole sector. You're only supposed to identify the specific organizations that are at risk and then apply very focused and proportionate mitigation measures. So the problem comes in when you have these pieces of legislation that are overly broad and impact the whole sector. Next slide, please. After this bill was introduced in Parliament, the Regional Financial Action Task Force body, the East and Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group, did a review of Angola in relation to its compliance with the Financial Action Task Force Recommendation 8. Unfortunately, the group held that Angola is not compliant with Recommendation 8. And this, of course, is being used as a justification for the bill. But if you look at the reasons for the rating of non-compliant, it's actually because there's been no comprehensive review of the non-profit sector to appropriately understand terrorist financing risks. There's been no targeted risk-based supervision or monitoring of non-profit organizations. And the non-profit sector has not yet been engaged to raise awareness about the potential vulnerabilities to terrorist financing, abuse, and risks. So the main issue is that there hasn't been a broad outreach to civil society to say, are there any risks? If so, what are they? Which organizations might be more at risk? And what can we do to address it? That's how the state and civil society could be compliant with Recommendation 8. If you read the report, it actually says that there is an existing law in Angola, the law on preventing and combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism. And its articles 45 and 46 are confirmed to already provide the legislative framework for identifying non-profit organizations which represent an increased risk and for reviewing the adequacy of legal or regulatory obligations applicable to non-profit organizations in view of the existing risks. So the legislation is there. The legislation is actually quite good. So this bill is not really necessary for this purpose. What's needed is outreach and policy. Next slide, please. So just to give an overview of what the bill is about, it provides a definition and classification of non-governmental organizations, both national and international. It provides the registration procedures for non-governmental organizations. It provides the role and powers of the NGO supervisory and monitoring body. It sets out the permitted areas of NGO activity. It has provisions on financing, restrictions, tax and customs, auditing, and asset management. It provides for the rights of beneficiaries and the rights of NGOs. It provides labor rules for foreign and national workers. And then it has duties for NGOs. and the procedures for suspension and termination of NGOs. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah. Why are we concerned about this bill? What are the provisions that we are most concerned about? There are provisions on registration of NGOs, which are simpler than the current prevailing 2002 decree, which requires registration with multiple ministries as well as the NGO coordinating body. But it's still not a simple notification procedure. There is a lot of documentation required, such as authorization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from your country of origin, if you're an international NGO. It has very confusing provisions requiring double registration for international NGOs, first with the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights, and then with the NGO monitoring and supervisory body. And it provides that registrations may be tacitly refused where requested documents are not presented within a short 10-day period. So it's not the simple notification procedure that's recommended under international law. And the next provision that we're particularly concerned about is an extensive list of the duties of NGOs. These are very vague and if they're not complied with, can result in termination of NGOs. So some examples of these duties include to refrain from subversive actions or actions that could be perceived as such. Subversive actions is not defined. To participate in implementation of economic and social programs approved by the executive. To refrain from engaging in or practicing activities directly or indirectly connected with money laundering, influencing peddling, and influencing terrorist financing. To promote, preserve, and respect the traditional customs and habits of the environment where NGOs are operating. To inform the supervisory body about the movement of expatriate staff with regard to hiring, transfer, and dismissal. And to report on the origin of funds and financial resources, on imported and domestically acquired goods, to provide a yearly action plan, and to report on partnerships established. Then the bill provides for the establishment of provides powers for supervision and monitoring of NGOs by an NGO supervisory body. This body is a state administrative entity determined by the president, so it lacks independence. The body registers NGOs, supervises NGOs in coordination with relevant sectors of state and provincial government, has powers to inspect NGO operations for compliance with the listed duties and the law in general, and must ensure that NGOs are not misused for terrorism. It promotes programs and projects complementing actions of the executive. It determines the location of NGO programs and projects with central or local government. It keeps a record of the beneficial owners, the management, and the government bodies' identities. And it ensures the suitability of NGO management and governance bodies. It also tracks NGOs' financial transactions. It reports to the Financial Intelligence Unit suspicions of funds derived from criminal activities or terrorist financing, and it can suspend and terminate NGOs that fail to comply with their duties. The bill also provides a lot of provisions relating to reporting, auditing, and financial restrictions. With regard to reporting, I mentioned that there are extensive reports throughout the year, and these reports are on the origin of funds and financial resources, lists of imported and internally acquired goods, yearly action plans, assessments of partnerships, information of the movement of expatriate staff, and identities of beneficiaries and persons who control or manage activities, including governing bodies and persons responsible for management. In relation to financial obligations and restrictions, it provides that NGOs can only acquire goods and equipment on the national market, that they can only dispose of assets from donations from abroad with prior authorization, and that they cannot re-export or resell goods and equipment acquired or imported using funds donated to the Angolan people. These must be delivered to the community through the NGO supervisory body. The bill also imposes cultural, societal, and moral obligations on NGOs, which are very vague. NGOs are required to promote, preserve, and respect the traditional customs and habits of the environment in which they operate. They are not to pursue purposes by immoral means. They are not to receive funding from organizations or persons involved in activities which call into question constitutionally enshrined interests. And they're not to engage in subversive acts or acts that could be perceived as such. These provisions lack legal certainty and may be imposed in a discriminatory manner, excluding and violating the rights of minority and marginalized persons, groups, and communities. Then very concerningly, the NGO body has powers of suspension of NGO activities. The grounds for suspension can be non-compliance with NGO duties, that the purpose of the NGO has been exhausted or made impossible, that its purpose has been pursued through unlawful or immoral means, that the activities of the NGO are not in conformity with their statutory object, and that they've committed or influenced acts contrary to the anti-money laundering and counter funding of terrorism rules. The procedure is not a judicial procedure. It's triggered by the supervisory body, and any interested party can denounce the NGO and report to the body that it suspects the NGO has violated its duties or practiced unlawful acts. And where the body deems that there is strong evidence of illicit acts or acts detrimental to the sovereignty, security, and integrity of Angola, it can suspend. Interested parties can also inform the Financial Intelligence Unit and the Public Prosecutor's Office of suspicions of money laundering and terrorist financing. The suspension decision can be appealed under general terms of the law, but this is not clearly defined in the bill. And if an NGO that has been suspended continues with its activity, then it will constitute a crime of disobedience. Finally, in relation to termination of NGOs, this may be by administrative procedure of the monitoring and supervisory body for violation of NGO duties. It can be by deliberative act of its members through a General Assembly. And for international NGOs, it can be when terminated by a decision in their country of origin, or if it's proved that their purposes or activities are contrary to constitutional order, they have incited or practiced violence, they've promoted tribalism, racism, dictatorship, fascism, or xenophobia, or they are militarized, or paramilitary type associations. So what are the main human rights concerns that we have, which are many, and I've just summarized the main provisions of concern, but please do read our analysis if you have time to get a more detailed legal analysis. Broadly speaking, the bill violates NGOs' right to freedom of association, also expression, privacy, and administrative justice. And this is contrary to the existing law of private associations, Article 48 of the Constitution, and also various international treaties to which Angola is party. The bill amounts to arbitrary, excessive, disproportionate, and vague, allows for arbitrary, excessive, disproportionate, and vague monitoring, supervision, suspension, and termination powers. The suspension and termination powers violate natural justice and fair trial rights because they don't allow for a court to be involved in the decision to terminate and suspend. The provisions lack legal clarity on the legal duties and obligations of NGOs. And generally, the bill amounts to executive overreach. It allows for the executive to interfere in the everyday operations of NGOs. And the body that is monitoring lacks independence because it's an executive body. And the bill compulsorily associates NGOs with executive projects where they should be separate and independent. It allows for excessive state interference and control of the sector. And the excessive reporting violates the right to privacy and to autonomy. And the provisions relating to the property of NGOs and use of its funds violates property and consumer rights. Generally, the bill restricts NGOs' autonomy and independence. The cultural, societal, and moral norms discriminate against minority and marginal groups. And the restrictions there are numerous restrictions on free expression. And the registration process is unduly bureaucratic. And finally, the vague anti-money laundering and counter-funding of terrorism provisions discriminate and stigmatize NGOs and may be subject to abuse. So, in conclusion, we hope that our analysis and this meeting can help you with your advocacy campaign. We have started an international advocacy campaign through Friends of Angola. We did write to the UN Special Rapporteurs on human rights defenders, for example, and they have communicated to the President that the bill does violate freedom of association. So that letter is another advocacy tool that you can use in your advocacy. And generally, we hope that you'll be able to engage with Parliament to call for removal of the bill and to call for a fresh, inclusive process to draft new, progressive and enabling legislation, as the existing legislation, the 2002 decree, is also in violation of various international human rights law standards. And we encourage you to promote a self-regulatory process for NGOs and to start an engagement with the state for consultations and trainings to address any potential money laundering or counter-funding of terrorism risks. And in this process, I hope that my colleague Irene will speak to you about this, and my colleague Rose. But we highly recommend that you engage with international coalitions like the Global NPO Coalition on the Financial Action Task Force and engage directly with the FATF bodies as well if you can. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Nanga in case she has any. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, mais uma salva de palmas para a senhora. Muito bem. Agora vou passar a palavra para a doutora Nanga, como está aqui na agenda. Doutora Nanga, a palavra é tua, por favor.
Bem, bom dia, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Eu não tenho mais nada a acrescentar, penso que a exposição da Fiona foi muito clara, muito objetiva, não é? Talvez, no final, penso que é também um dos propósitos da reunião, é refletirmos um pouco como é que vamos fortalecer esse movimento de prevenir que a lei seja aprovada.
Muito obrigado. Eu não sei se a sala podem, o pessoal que está no Zoom conseguem ouvir. Ana, agradeceria que me desse um sinal se está ouvindo muito bem. Está a receber sinal que me podem ouvir. Eu, mais uma vez, agradecer tanto a senhora Fiona Leaf como a doutora Nanga por dispensarem um tempo, estarem aqui conosco para falarem do seu conhecimento em relação a esta proposta de lei que preocupa-nos todos. Eu agora vou passar a palavra à diretora regional para a África do Centro Internacional para os Direitos da Organização Sem Fins Lucrativos, senhora Irene Petras. A senhora Irene Petras penso que está online.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Maybe I think the people on the Zoom can hear. I just want to make sure that those in the room can hear.
Yes, we can hear you. If you could just please give us a second just to fix something here in the room. Thank you. Yes, you may begin, please. Thank you so much.
Nós aconselhamos a usar os computadores. O som vai direto para o
Hi, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We can hear you, but I think the volume is not high enough. If you could please either increase the volume or speak a little bit louder, please. I'm not sure what was the issue. Was this technical or just your mic?
Have seen over the years, particularly the last few years, is that it's become a big issue for the sector. And in fact, in Southern Africa, more than 75% of the countries had already introduced laws.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Hello? I'm so sorry. We had some technical issue here on Rome. My apologies. If you could please just start it again. I'm really sorry. It's just folks here in Rome couldn't hear you before.
All right. You can hear me now?
Now, yes, now we can hear you. Thank you so much.
Okay. So thanks very much. What I was saying was that when I started working at ICNL in 2016, there were, that was the first time that I heard about FATF. And I really couldn't see the link between FATF and terrorism financing and civil society. But I think as many of us have seen over the last few years, it really has become a very serious trend on the continent. In SADC alone, 75% of the countries, the governments have introduced laws that affect non-profit organizations and have used terrorism financing and FATF as a justification for clamping down on civil society. So I think this is a challenge for us all, whether we are in Angola, whether we are Zimbabwean, throughout the continent. And we've seen this also in other regions. So it's not just Africa alone that is facing these problems and seeing this trend of very restrictive laws. And of course, we know that terrorism and terrorism financing is a very serious issue that needs to be addressed. We know that governments are worried about it. We know that banks are worried about it. And even us as civil society are worried about it because it affects the way that we can operate, our financing, and all of that kind of thing. But we have to make sure that any restrictions are ones that do not prevent us from doing our work. So I'm going to share a presentation. I hope that you're able to see this for those who are in the room. Maybe if someone can. And just to, okay. I think you can probably see the next slide as well. Is that right? Are you seeing just one screen?
Yeah. And here we can see as well from the room.
Okay. If you go to display settings at the top of your screen in the middle, there should be an option just to project the presentation and not have your notes as well. Where is that now? Display settings. So this one, right? Yes, that's correct. Great, thanks. I did the tutorial. Okay. So, three things, if anything, that I would like you to take away from this presentation. The first one is that any measures to counter money laundering and terrorism financing are applied only to a certain group of non-profit organizations that have been found to be at risk of terrorism financing. The second is that legislation is not an effective way to address risk, and in fact, in many cases, it can actually fuel money laundering and terrorism financing. And then the third is that any measures that are put in place to counter money laundering and terrorism financing mustn't violate national and international protections on freedom of association. So whether you are doing advocacy at the national level, whether you are doing solidarity work regionally or internationally, these are the three important talking points, apart from the legal analysis and other tools that are there. Just a quick overview of FATF. It's a very technical issue, but I wanted to just set out what it is for those who might not know. And there are a lot of resources which we can share on this. FATF is very similar to other multilateral agencies like the UN, the African Commission, but it sets standards on money laundering and terrorism financing. And it assesses how governments have technically complied in putting measures to combat terrorism financing and how effective those measures have been. So they do evaluations like you heard for the Angolan evaluation which happened recently. More than 200 countries are part of FATF, and they are regularly evaluated by the Financial Action Task Force. And they're very worried about it because the outcome of an evaluation can have implications on international investment, economically. You know that governments are more worried about the economics than the politics and governance issues. And the FATF is implemented through different regional bodies. You heard Fiona talk about SADC, which oversees the East and Southern Africa region. So basically what happens when FATF evaluates a country is they look at two things. They look at the technical compliance. So for recommendation 8, which applies to the non-profit sector, they look at the adequacy of the laws and the regulations that relate to the sector for those How do they do that? If you can see the circle in this slide, you see that the non-profit sector as a whole is the whole round circle. FATF itself doesn't oversee all non-profit organizations. There's a specific definition for NPOs which are looked at by the Financial Action Task Force, and that is the ones that you see here in the orange, the light orange and the dark orange. And then what they do is they focus on those orange organizations and they look at whether there is a risk to any of those organizations. And then they will identify those organizations which are most at risk, and that is the very small piece that you see here in the dark orange. And that is the group of organizations that should be regulated to make sure that they are not subject or at risk of being used for terrorism financing. So it's a very small sector. What do they do after that? FATF looks at whether the government has put in place measures for that small group of organizations which will help them to deal with the risks that they face. If you can see now, this is the process that governments should take, a very simple process. Firstly, they should conduct a risk assessment. So they should look at all the NPOs and they should identify those ones which are at risk of terrorist abuse. Then they should review the laws and see if those laws address the risk for that small group of NPOs. If there's any gaps, we move to number 3 and measures are put in place to close that risk and to make sure that it is mitigated. And 4, they make sure that any measures that are put in place comply with the international legal framework. And throughout this whole process, they should be conducting outreach and working together with NGOs. Now, in cases like Angola and a lot of other countries and colleagues who are on this call, you see that they just forget about these other steps and they go straight for number 2. We have to make a good impression. We have to show FATF that we are managing this risk. So let's just introduce legislation on the entire sector. They don't do a risk assessment. They don't make sure that the legislation only applies to certain organizations. They just introduce a bill that will then apply and have implications on all of the sector. What happens then? This is not an effective way to address the money laundering and the terrorism financing risk. In fact, it creates more risks because these governments are putting in place so many regulations and directives and requirements on NGOs that we all spend our time trying to comply, And we don't actually put in place measures that are looking at the terrorism risk and making sure that we can identify it and make sure that our organizations are not subject or at risk to that. These, like I said at the beginning, each country requires its own solutions, and the legislation is not the best way to go about it. Most of the times, the measures that could be put in place are non-legal, outreach to the sector, awareness raising on the vulnerabilities that organizations have on terrorist financing, education, training for the sector, targeted supervision, and sector self-regulation. And we'll see that even FATF has now accepted that this bad implementation of recommendation 8 is having these unintended consequences. And they are taking measures now. They're reviewing the best practices paper, which looks at how recommendation 8 is enforced, and looking at how to provide more guidance to governments to make sure that they don't abuse this process. So what does this all mean for Angolan civil society and their supporters? When you look at legislation, look out for some of these ways in which governments have been targeting and putting restrictions on NGOs. There's time limits here, but there's more information. But a lot of these issues are actually identified in the Angolan NGO bill, and you can go through. They put in place, very burdensome registration requirements, very burdensome internal governance requirements, and financial reporting, which is excessive, and gives the government and regulatory authorities a lot of powers to suspend and investigate and resolve CSOs. So those are the types of things that you need to look at in the legislation and make sure that they comply with the international standards. Particularly of use, I think, is to draw your attention to the guidelines on freedom of association and assembly in Africa. These were produced by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And ICNL has produced a checklist which you can use to go through legislation and see that it complies with these guidelines. So any NGO legislation or legislation that affects NGOs, you can use the checklist to see if they comply with the guidelines. The last thing that I want to focus on is on engagement. How can we engage, whether it's at the national, regional, or the global level? I think we've seen already commendable efforts by the Angolan civil society to engage nationally. In many countries, civil society has set up NGO working groups or broader groups that will look at anti-money laundering and financial issues. And these groups have been engaging with the NPO regulator and the Financial Intelligence Agency to talk about the restrictions of the proposed legislation and try and get them to change. In some countries, we worked with partners who have actually cooperated with government and had joint trainings and joint sessions to go through the legislation and see why exactly some provisions are not good for the sector and to try and review them. At the national level, there can be direct engagement with the FATF-style regional body, which is the SADC for Southern and East Africa. And there's very useful FATF civil society networks in East Africa, Southern and West Africa, which have been working a long time now, some years, and who can help you to engage with those FATF-style regional bodies. We can provide more information, and in fact, some of those who will be presenting next are in those regional networks, to which ICNL provides support. But you can also engage the African Commission Support Group on Freedom of Association and Assembly. This is the link with the African Commission guidelines, which I talked about. And and you can send information to the African Commission, and the support group will bring it to the attention of the Commission where the legislation is falling short. Finally, on the global level, I think Björn's already talked about the UN special procedures, but there's a global NPR coalition on budget that ICNL and others are members of, and we are able to connect to the FATF Secretariat to alert them of some of these issues, or sometimes if civil society in a country is not willing or there's some limitations to them being able to directly engage, we can do it on their behalf. We will also set up an expert hub on anti-money laundering and terrorism financing, which can assist with interventions at all three levels. There's a lot of African experts now who are part of this hub and who would be willing to help. So I think on that note, I will end. There are some resources that we've produced that you can learn more about FATF, you can learn more about how governments are misusing it, and we've just recently developed a guide of positive practices in implementing recommendation 8. So I'll be happy to share these and translated versions of the presentation and other resources, and happy to take any questions as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I'm sorry, I'm just on page one. So, muito obrigado.
Thank you, Henry, for your presentation. Now we will have an opportunity to hear from colleagues from other countries in the region that have been fighting restricted NGO laws. We have online Linda from Zambia, who is the Executive Director of Chapter 1 Foundation. We also have from Tanzania, Dr. Inshallah. I will leave it to our folks in the room to do a further introduction of the speakers. And we have Ms. Kitaria Kirengana from Mozambique. And I think that in the room we also have Ms. Rosalind Hanzi, who's joining us from Zimbabwe. Florindo or Emilio, I'll pass it on to you.
Muito obrigado, Ana. Eu gostaria mais uma vez de agradecer pela apresentação. Eu vou passar agora a palavra ao Emílio. O Emílio irá moderar o prosseguimento das apresentações. E é interessante, eu só dei conta agora que eu apresentei todo mundo, menos a mim mesmo. Estou nunca tarde, mas mais tarde do que nunca. Mas pronto. Muito obrigado. Eu vou passar a palavra a Emílio. Emílio, a palavra é tua. Obrigado.
Obrigado, Florindo. Então, vou convidar a nossa colega e companheira do Mosaico para tomar o lugar por Angola. E também a Rosalind, please, have a seat. Nós vamos começar a nossa apresentação pedindo os nossos colegas que estão conectados. Espero que tenham uma boa audibilidade. Então, vamos começar com a ilustre senhora Linda Kasonde, diretora executiva Shuttle One Foundation. Please, Madam Linda Kasonde, can you take the floor, please? And the question is quais as disposições específicas da legislação proposta às ONGs que suscitaram maior preocupação do ponto de vista da sociedade civil da Zâmbia. Eu vou repetir. Quais as disposições específicas da legislação proposta para as ONGs que suscitaram maior preocupação do ponto de vista da sociedade civil? Essa é a primeira pergunta. E a segunda é, como é que o governo da Zâmbia está a tentar aderir às recomendações do GAFI sem restringir o espaço cívico? Eu vou repetir as perguntas. A primeira pergunta: quais as disposições específicas da legislação proposta para ONGs que suscitaram maior preocupação do ponto de vista da sociedade civil da Zâmbia? Esta é a primeira pergunta. A segunda é, como é que o governo da Zâmbia está a tentar aderir às recomendações do GAFI sem restringir o espaço cívico? Please, you have 5 minutes, only 5, please. Take the floor.
Five minutes. Hello?
Yes, Madame Linda. 5 minutes.
Florindo, would you mind repeating the question? I'm not sure, Linda, if you got the translation, but Florindo, maybe Florindo can just ask the question in English?
The question is, what is the provision in the proposal of law and the civil society is aware about that? This is the first question. The second, what kind of engagement the civic society have with the government about the recommendation of the GAFI? You got it? Yes, you have 5 minutes, please.
Okay, I did receive some questions in advance, which I did respond to. It should take me about 5 to 10 minutes to respond to those questions that I received, because I really can't hear very well. I'm so sorry about that, but I think I'll cover the answers that you're looking for. So, the Zambian NGO Act was enacted in 2009. And like many of your countries, the government's justification for introducing the act was that it intended to curb terrorist financing and also to ensure that the general public, rather than the unsuspecting public, would be protected from being abused by some of the activities that were carried out by NGOs. So when this act was enacted, CSOs in Zambia immediately sensed the danger from the act, which amongst other things required the following. Firstly, registration of NGOs, which meant the threat of deregistration if the NGO board found in breach of the act. The board under the NGO Act was largely comprised of government officials and people appointed by the government. So you can see the risk there. The government doesn't like it. They think you're a dissident. Either they won't register you or they will find an excuse to deregister you. And then also was the requirement of filing annual returns, which had to contain information about the NGO's activities and also its sources of income. So CSOs in Zambia subsequently filed a case in court to challenge the NGO Act. And at the time, we had a very reasonable Attorney General in office. And he sat down with us as NGOs and agreed to halt the implementation of the NGO Act pending the amendment of the Act. So the Act was going to be reviewed and subsequently amended according to, well, they suggested that it would be amended to meet to address our concerns rather. So that was in 2009. And since then, there's been a number of drafts that have been proposed, that have proposed amendments to the Act and have been circulated among the CSOs and other stakeholders, but none of them have been enacted. And if you can do the math, it's been 14 years since the Act was enacted. And although some NGOs did go ahead to register when the Act was enacted, I'd say the most critical voices in the CSO sector haven't registered. I know there's been no consequences so far. So where we are now is I believe that civil society organizations in Zambia have been somewhat lulled into a false sense of security, or maybe, particularly in respect of the period from between 2011 and 2021, when the patriotic Trump government was in office, we were simply overwhelmed by the amount of rule of law and human rights abuses conducted by that previous government. So I believe that it is now time, that the time is now right, to challenge the constitutionality of the NGO Act on the basis that it is not justifiable under our constitution or even under the budget recommendations, which clearly do not require a blanket regulation of the NGO sector. Read recommendation 8, it talks about targeted regulation of NGOs that are potentially a risk in terms of terrorist financing. The other excuse given was that the NGO Act provided a vehicle under which the activities of NGOs, which are intended to serve the public, can be monitored to avoid the public being, if you like,